The mountains swallowed sound in that part of West Virginia, the way deep water swallows light. Every visitor said the same thing: the woods around the Benjamin cabin were too quiet, too still, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Folks from the nearest town kept to the roads, never the tree lanes, and always hurried home before dusk settled between the pines. They claimed the woods had a voice, but only those who shouldn't hear it ever did. Benjamin's daughters were among them. The old cabin leaned toward the forest as though listening. Its windows stared into the dark with an unease that didn't belong to glass and timber. At night, the wind carried something more than cold. It carried whispers. The girls said the voices slithered in through the floorboards, creeping up from the ground beneath the house, curling into their beds like invisible smoke. Benjamin dismissed them all, his face tightening in that silent, warning way he had perfected over the years. The kind of look that froze questions in their throats. But the girls still heard the forest. They couldn't help it. Some nights it spoke gently, almost coaxing. Other nights it shouted, sharp, angry, as if trying to wake something that had been sleeping for too long. One November evening, the older daughter stood on the back porch long after everyone else had gone to bed. A thin fog had crawled between the trees, pooling low, dimly lit by the moon. She swore she saw someone standing at the edge of the woods. Not an animal, not a shadow, someone. Tall. Unmoving. Staring straight at the cabin. When she blinked, it was gone, leaving only the sound of brittle leaves crunching under feet that did not belong to her. Inside, Benjamin snapped awake at the same moment, breathing hard, sweat chilling on his skin. He claimed he'd heard nothing, but his hands trembled as he locked the back door. He double-checked it twice, then a third time, whispering something under his breath the girls didn't catch. Something that didn't sound like a prayer. That night the voices grew louder. They didn't whisper this time, they called. Called by name. Not the daughters. His. And Benjamin knew he could no longer pretend the past was buried. The woods had remembered. And they had finally come back for what he stole from them. It starts with the discovery of a bundle of old letters found tucked behind a loose stone in the cellar of the abandoned house where the sisters once lived. These letters were fragile, written in fading ink, but what made them alarming was not just their age but the tone of panic and secrecy woven through every sentence. They were not addressed to anyone specific, almost as if the writer had intended them to be found by whoever came after, someone who might understand the warnings hidden between the lines. The writer described voices echoing outside the windows at night, footsteps circling the house even when the family was certain they lived miles from the nearest neighbor, and strange symbols carved into the trees that seemed to appear overnight. At first glance, these notes looked like the ramblings of someone losing their grip on reality, but the consistency of the details, combined with the desperation of the language, made investigators pause. These were not random fears, they were records of events experienced repeatedly and with increasing intensity. As researchers dug deeper, they found evidence that the family had tried to report these incidents years before anything tragic happened, but their concerns had been dismissed by both neighbors and local authorities. The community had a reputation for brushing off unusual complaints, preferring to attribute anything odd to superstition, folklore, or simple imagination. This dismissive attitude had allowed the situation to escalate unchecked. The sisters, still young at the time, were exposed to an environment where fear grew quietly, unchallenged, and unspoken. The family lived in isolation, not by choice but by the subtle pressure exerted by the surrounding town, which avoided the property for reasons no one could clearly explain. It was as if the house carried a stigma nobody wanted to acknowledge openly. People whispered about curses, spirits, and bad omens, but when pressed for specifics, their explanations dissolved into vague stories passed down through generations. What made this key point so important was the realization that the earliest signs of danger had nothing to do with the sensational elements added later by rumor and retelling. Instead, the origin of the entire case lay in a slow build-up of ignored warnings, strange occurrences, and a family's growing sense that they were being watched or followed by something they couldn't quite name. The letters illustrated a gradual descent into fear, marking the beginning of the long chain of events that would eventually evolve into the disturbing mystery surrounding the sisters and the community that failed to protect them. The footprints showed up after a night of relentless wind, the kind that scraped branches against the cabin walls and made the daughters believe the forest was trying to claw its way inside. Morning brought an eerie stillness, the kind that felt staged, as if the woods had paused to watch them step outside. The girls were the first to notice the impressions around the property, odd, deep marks in the mud that circled the cabin in a silent, intentional loop. At first glance they seemed like boot prints, but the shape was wrong. Too long. Too wide. The toes tapered unnaturally, and the heel area looked more like the back of an animal's paw than a shoe. Benjamin crouched beside one of the prints, running his fingers over the edges with a face drained of color. He said it was probably a black bear wandering too close, but the daughters exchanged a silent disagreement. Bears didn't walk in perfect circles. And they certainly didn't take steps that measured nearly 2 feet apart. The odd spacing suggested something tall, something moving with deliberate purpose rather than mindless wandering. The prints also weren't uniform, some pressed deep, as though whatever made them had stood still for a long moment, watching the cabin. Others were faint, almost vanishing, which made it seem as if the creature alternated between walking heavily and gliding lightly across the ground. The girls couldn't shake the feeling that it had been studying them, lingering close to windows and doorways. One print near the back steps was angled upward slightly, like the figure had paused mid-step before changing direction. That single mark made both daughters uneasy, because it gave the impression of hesitation, almost as if the thing had wanted to approach the door more directly before deciding against it. Benjamin tried to brush mud back over the tracks, but the damp soil only smeared, leaving grotesque shapes that looked even worse. His movements were brisk, almost frantic, and the daughters noticed he kept glancing toward the shadowed tree-line as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. When the older daughter followed his gaze, she could have sworn she saw a gap in the trees where something had been moments earlier. A faint shimmer of movement. A branch swaying long after the rest had stilled. By midday, the prints had mostly dried into hardened impressions, and Benjamin ordered the girls inside. He locked the door even though the sun was still bright. He didn't offer explanations, didn't try to reassure them. He simply muttered that the woods were acting strange again, a phrase that meant nothing to the girls but seemed to carry a heavy, private meaning for him. The footprints remained outside like silent warnings, and the girls sensed that whatever had walked around their cabin the night before wasn't finished with them yet. It happened on a night when the wind died so completely that the silence felt unnatural, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The older daughter had fallen asleep near the fireplace, exhausted from the tension that had hung over the cabin for days. When she woke, dawn was pressing pale light into the windows, and she immediately sensed something was wrong. Her sister's blanket was empty. The door was unlocked. One boot was lying on its side near the threshold, the laces trailing across the floor like it had been kicked off during a hurried exit. Benjamin was nowhere in sight, but his rifle was missing from above the mantel, which told her he had noticed the disappearance before she did. Outside, the morning air was cold enough to sting her nose, and a thin fog curled low across the grass. She followed the faint indentation of barefoot steps leading away from the porch and into the tree line. Barefoot. That was the detail that made her chest tighten. Her sister hated the cold, hated stepping outside without shoes, yet the tracks showed she had walked deep into the woods with no hesitation. There were no signs of struggle, no torn fabric, no drag marks, just a straight line of prints that vanished into the underbrush. It was as if she had gone willingly, or had been guided by something she trusted. That thought disturbed her more than the disappearance itself. Benjamin returned around mid-morning, his clothes damp with sweat and dew, but he carried no sign of his daughter and no explanation. His expression was tight, unreadable, the kind of look he wore when he was withholding something. When the older daughter demanded to know where her sister was, he simply said she would come back when she snapped out of it, offering no hint as to what it meant. His voice held a strange edge, not grief or fear but something closer to resignation, as if this had happened before. Hours crawled by in a suffocating hush. The woods seemed to press closer to the cabin with each passing moment. Then, just after noon, the missing girl staggered out from between the trees. Her hair was tangled with twigs, her feet cut and bleeding, her clothes different from what she had worn the night before. Instead of her flannel nightshirt, she now had on a long, oversized men's shirt she had never seen before, one that smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth. When asked where she had been, she stared blankly, her voice flat as she said she didn't remember leaving the cabin at all. She claimed the last thing she recalled was falling asleep. Benjamin didn't press her. The older sister did, but each question made the younger girl's eyes glaze further, like she was listening to something far away. Something calling her back. The strangeness of the borrowed shirt and the missing memories left a lingering dread between them, because deep down, both daughters knew she had not gone into the woods alone. Her sleepwalking began quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, with small sounds in the night that the older sister dismissed as tossing and turning. But soon those soft movements turned into the unmistakable thump of bare feet crossing the wooden floor. The first time she found her younger sister standing in the doorway at 3 in the morning, eyes wide open but utterly empty, she froze. The girl's hair hung limp over her face, and her breathing was slow, almost measured, as though she were listening to something beyond human hearing. When the older sister whispered her name, she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Instead, she took a step forward, her body rigid and controlled, moving with a strange precision that felt wrong for someone asleep. The girl walked straight toward the front door, reached for the latch, and tugged at it with slow determination. The older sister grabbed her wrist and pulled her back, startled by how cold her skin felt. She guided her to bed, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself, and the moment the girl's head touched the pillow, her entire body went slack, as though she had been released from someone else's grip. By morning, she remembered nothing, not even the bruises forming on her wrist from where she had been held. The episodes grew worse. Each night, the girl rose earlier, walked farther, and spoke more. At first it was mumbling, broken syllables without meaning. Then the words became clearer, forming fragments that made the older sister's stomach hollow with dread. She began speaking to the woods outside, calling into the darkness as if expecting something to answer. Sometimes she whispered questions, other times laughter slipped out, slow and cold, a sound that didn't match the little sister she knew. The forest seemed to respond, too. On the nights the girl sleepwalked, the wind outside fell strangely silent, letting her voice carry unbroken into the trees. Benjamin pretended not to notice, though the strain in his face deepened with every incident, and his hands shook slightly when he checked the locks before bed. He never asked what the girl said during her episodes. It was as if he was terrified to know. Once, when the older sister tried to wake him during an especially disturbing night, her sibling standing barefoot in the yard, arms raised toward the tree-line, Benjamin refused to come to the door. He stayed in his room, muttering that certain things shouldn't be interrupted, that some calls had to run their course. His words didn't sound like advice, they sounded like experience. The younger girl's voice grew deeper during the sleepwalking, resonant with a tone that wasn't hers. She would tilt her head toward the woods as if hearing someone speak directly into her mind. The way she responded, nodding slowly, sometimes smiling faintly, made it clear she wasn't wandering aimlessly. She was following instructions. And each night she ventured a little closer to the edge of the forest, as though something just beyond the trees was waiting patiently for her to arrive. Benjamin's unraveling began subtly, the way rot spreads beneath a floorboard, quiet, hidden, inevitable. At first he carried his unease in small gestures, lingering at the window a little too long, pausing mid-sentence as if listening to a voice only he could hear, tightening his grip on the doorknob each evening as he checked the lock for the third or fourth time. The daughters noticed the change immediately. He moved through the cabin like a man expecting an attack, not from a person, but from something older, something that had been watching him far longer than they realized. His eyes, once sharp with the sternness they had grown up fearing, now darted toward shadows even when the lamps were lit. He flinched at sounds that didn't exist. At night, when the younger daughter sleepwalked, the older one sometimes caught him sitting fully awake in the dark, staring at the wall as though waiting for it to speak. The paranoia deepened with every strange occurrence around the property. The footprints, the missing hours from his daughter's memory, the voices that only the girls admitted hearing, none of it surprised him. Instead, each incident seemed to confirm something he already believed, something he had spent years trying to pretend wasn't true. He muttered to himself more frequently now, low and frantic, phrases that slipped out only when he thought the girls were asleep. They heard him whisper about debts, about promises broken, and about the woods coming to collect. His voice trembled each time, carrying a crack of guilt that neither daughter could understand. Benjamin began drinking heavily again despite swearing years before he'd given it up. The whiskey bottle stayed hidden behind the stove, but the girls could smell it on him every time he returned from the woods at dusk. Sometimes he stumbled back with his clothes torn, his hands covered in dirt, insisting he had been hunting even though he carried no game. The older daughter asked once what he was really doing out there. His answer came too quickly, too sharply, like someone trying to bury the truth beneath volume, keeping them out. He didn't specify who them was. By late November, sleep became impossible for him. The floor creaked under his pacing footsteps until dawn. He began blocking windows with heavy quilts and moving furniture against the doors, claiming the cold was getting worse even when the girls insisted the temperature felt the same. He refused to let them go outside alone, and when an owl cried from the woods, he panicked so violently that he dropped his lantern and shattered it. The daughters watched him unravel in real time, piece by fragile piece. Yet what frightened them most wasn't the paranoia itself, it was the way he never denied the things they told him. When they whispered about the voices, he didn't correct them. When they described the feeling of being watched, he didn't laugh. His silence felt like admission. And the longer they observed him, the clearer it became that their father wasn't simply afraid of the woods. He was afraid of what the woods remembered about him, and of the moment those memories would finally step out of the darkness and into the light. The disappearance of the hunter from town changed the mood around the cabin in a way that nothing else had. Until then, the strange events felt contained, terrifying, yes, but limited to Benjamin and his daughters. When news spread that someone else had vanished, someone who had no connection to the family at all, the threat suddenly felt wider, as if the woods were drawing a circle that now included anyone who stepped too close. The hunter, a man named Colin Hayes, was well known in town for his skill. He wasn't the kind of man who got lost easily. He'd hunted those mountains since childhood, knew the ridgelines and ravines like the back of his weathered hands. So when his truck was found abandoned on a muddy pull-off just a mile from Benjamin's cabin, locals stopped whispering about bad weather or accidents. They whispered about curses. About old things waking up. And always, inevitably, about Benjamin. The daughters overheard the rumors when Benjamin sent them into town for supplies one cold afternoon. People lowered their voices when they walked by, but not enough. Words like coincidence and, again, hung in the air, followed by glances that darted away too quickly. Even the store clerk refused to meet their eyes. On the drive back, the older daughter watched her father's knuckles whiten on the steering wheel as she mentioned Colin's disappearance. He didn't react with concern or shock, only a grim stillness that suggested he had been expecting it. He muttered under his breath about people wandering where they shouldn't, about the woods, answering when they've been ignored too long, but he refused to explain further. At home, the atmosphere grew heavier. The woods seemed louder at night, more restless. The younger daughter swore she heard someone calling for help deep among the pines, a voice rough and strained, yet familiar. She recognized it from somewhere, though she could not recall exactly where. Benjamin snapped at her when she mentioned it, his voice cracking with anger and fear. He insisted no one was out there, then immediately contradicted himself by boarding up one of the back windows and refusing to let the girls step outside after sunset. The sheriff came by once to question Benjamin, but the conversation was short and tense. Benjamin claimed he had heard nothing unusual, though the older daughter noticed his hands trembling behind his back. The sheriff looked around the property with unease, lingering on the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. When night fell, the girls listened to the forest groan and shift, the wind threading through the branches like a voice struggling to form words. Every so often, a sharp crack echoed, too heavy for an animal, too purposeful for falling limbs. Benjamin sat by the door with his rifle balanced across his knees, his eyes fixed on the darkness. He didn't tell the girls what he feared was out there, but his posture said everything. Colin wasn't coming back. And whatever had taken him was growing bolder, moving closer, as if marking its path toward the cabin inch by careful inch. The discovery of the hidden cellar began with a loose floorboard the older daughter stepped on while sweeping, a hollow thump that didn't match the solid sound of the others. She called her sister over, and the two knelt on the rough boards, pressing and tapping until they found the exact point where the wood dipped slightly under pressure. Benjamin had left earlier that morning, claiming he needed to check his traps before the weather turned, so the girls were alone in the cabin, the silence heavy enough to feel like a warning. Still, curiosity pulled them forward. They pried up the warped plank, revealing a narrow gap below, then another board loosened, then another, until they uncovered a small, square opening with a rusted metal ring embedded at its edge. They exchanged a look, fear mixed with something sharper, a need to understand what their father had been hiding all these years. The younger daughter tugged the ring, and a wooden hatch creaked open, releasing a breath of cold, stale air that smelled of mold and something older. A ladder descended into the darkness, its rungs covered in dust except for a few places where they had clearly been touched more recently. Lantern in hand, the older daughter climbed down first, her sister close behind. Their feet hit dirt and broken concrete. The cellar was small, cramped, and colder than the rest of the cabin, as though the earth itself resented being disturbed. Shelves lined the walls, empty except for a few cracked jars and bundles of old rope. At first it looked forgotten, a place no one had used in decades. But on a table in the corner sat a stack of cassette tapes, neatly arranged, each labeled with dates written in Benjamin's clumsy handwriting, some recent, others going back years. The girls exchanged another glance, their unease deepening. They picked up one of the tapes. On its label was a date from 2 summers ago, a time when their father had abruptly disappeared for 3 days, claiming he'd been stuck in town due to a washed-out bridge. They had believed him. Now they weren't sure. The older daughter found a dusty tape recorder tucked beneath the table. Its batteries were corroded, but when she plugged it in using an old wall socket, it crackled to life. She pressed play. At first there was only static, a distant hiss like icy wind pushing through trees. Then Benjamin's voice emerged, low, strained, talking to someone who never answered. He spoke of bargains, of keeping them at bay, of guilt that pressed on his chest like a weight. He begged something to stop watching him, to leave the girls alone, to take him instead. The younger daughter covered her mouth with her hand, trembling as the voice on the tape shifted, cracking into fear. Then came the last words on the recording, spoken in a whisper that barely rose above the static. I can hear you in the woods. I know you're still there. I know what you want. The tape clicked off, and the cellar fell into silence. For the first time, the daughters understood that whatever stalked their home wasn't new. It had always been there. And Benjamin had been hiding his conversations with it in the darkness beneath their feet. The storm rolled in just after sunset, swallowing the last traces of daylight in a wall of dark clouds that pressed low over the cabin roof. Thunder cracked so violently it rattled the dishes in the cupboards, and Benjamin ordered the girls into the cellar before the wind could tear the windows loose. They hurried down the narrow ladder while he followed, slamming the hatch behind him. The lantern's glow wavered across the stone walls, casting long, trembling shadows that stretched and shrank with every flicker. Rain hammered the roof above, but it was another sound, one too deliberate, too steady, that made all 3 of them go rigid. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, and unmistakably human. They came from the room directly above the cellar, moving in a measured rhythm, crossing from one side of the cabin to the other. At first the older daughter thought the storm was playing tricks on them, that the pounding rain had distorted into something more ominous. But the steps were too intentional, each one landing exactly where a person would walk if they were navigating the cabin by memory. The intruder moved toward the kitchen, paused, then turned down the hall. Benjamin stood completely still, his breath held tight in his chest, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as the footsteps continued their steady patrol. The girls exchanged a nervous glance. If Benjamin was down here with them, and he was, then someone else was up there. Someone who didn't bother to hide their presence. Lightning flashed outside, sending a pale, ghostly beam through the narrow gaps in the floorboards. For a moment the girls swore they saw a shadow pass overhead, long and hunched, disappearing before they could fully trace its shape. The younger daughter clutched Benjamin's sleeve. He didn't look at her. Instead, his jaw tightened, and he whispered a single phrase under his breath, too soft for them to catch but sharp enough to show he knew exactly what was happening. The footsteps paused above the trapdoor. The boards groaned as weight shifted directly on top of them. The lantern sputtered, dimming for a heartbeat. A low, almost dragging sound followed, like fingertips or nails brushing across the wood. The girls shuddered, but Benjamin didn't move. His stare was rooted to the ceiling, his face pale and drawn. He looked less like a man surprised by danger and more like someone who had been anticipating this moment for years. Then came a knock. One single, sharp, deliberate strike on the trapdoor. Not the erratic pounding of a storm-loosened branch, but the kind of knock someone makes when they know you're inside and expect you to answer. The cellar fell so quiet the girls could hear their own breathing. Benjamin's shoulders sagged under the weight of a truth he had tried desperately to avoid. The knock didn't frighten him because it was unexpected. It frightened him because it was overdue. The voice came long after the storm had settled into a steady, distant rumble, when the night outside was thick and unmoving, as if the forest itself were waiting for permission to breathe again. The girls had barely recovered from the knock on the trapdoor when Benjamin ordered them to stay put and climb the ladder to make sure the hatch was secure. He pressed his ear to the wood for a long moment, listening with the tension of someone expecting not silence, but an answer. When nothing happened, he descended again, his hands trembling so visibly that even the lantern's dim glow couldn't hide it. The girls wanted him to explain. They wanted him to lie, at the very least, to say that the storm had caused the noises or that an animal had somehow climbed onto the roof. But Benjamin didn't offer excuses. He simply stared at the dirt floor, jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched beneath his cheek. Hours passed like that, thick and suffocating. The cellar felt colder, as though the air had thinned. The younger daughter eventually drifted into an uneasy half-sleep, but the older one sat awake, cataloging every creak, every rustle, every change in the wind. Then it happened, so soft at first she thought she had imagined it. A voice drifted through the floorboards, low and distant, but unmistakably human. It threaded through the lingering thunder like a whisper being carried by something older than weather. What made her skin prickle wasn't that someone was calling from the woods. It was the name they used. They called for Benjamin. Not shouted. Called. Calmly, almost coaxing, as though inviting him outside. The voice repeated his name again, drawing it out slowly, stretching it until it sounded more like an accusation than a summons. The older daughter nudged her sister awake, and both stared upward, frozen in place. Benjamin didn't look confused or startled. He didn't ask if they heard it. He didn't deny it. Instead, he closed his eyes as if he had been waiting to hear that voice for a long time. His shoulders slumped in a way that suggested not fear, but inevitability. The voice continued, each repetition gaining clarity. There was something eerily familiar in the tone, a cadence the girls had heard before but couldn't place. Then the voice said something different, something that made Benjamin flinch so violently he knocked over the lantern. In the brief flash before it steadied, the girls saw his expression twist with raw panic. The voice from the wood spoke a sentence that no living person could have known, a phrase tied to a night Benjamin refused to talk about, a night buried in the family's past like a corpse under frozen ground. The girls didn't know what those words meant. But from the way Benjamin staggered back, gripping the wall as though the earth had tilted beneath him, they understood one thing clearly: the forest wasn't merely calling him. It was accusing him. And whatever memory had been spoken aloud, it was something he had prayed would never resurface. The final revelation struck with a force that overshadowed every disturbing detail uncovered before it, as if the entire story had been steadily climbing toward this moment of grim clarity. For years, the locals had whispered about strange voices, wandering lights, and eerie disappearances, but now investigators realized these weren't random or supernatural events. They were part of a pattern that stretched far deeper into the community's past than anyone had dared to imagine. When the last sealed box was opened in the storage room beneath the old church, the papers inside revealed a carefully maintained record of names, dates, and confessions, each tied to someone who had tried to expose the church's hidden rituals or challenge the authority of those who led it. Instead of preserving spiritual guidance, the elders had been documenting their own actions, keeping track of threats, punishments, and the people who had mysteriously vanished over the decades. The strange behavior of the community, the silence, the reluctance to discuss certain topics, the quick dismissal of outsiders' questions, suddenly made sense when it became clear that fear, not faith, had been holding the town together. The most disturbing part was the discovery that the voices reported in the woods weren't spirits or hallucinations but recordings. Hidden among the trees were old metal devices rigged to replay fragments of confessions, screams, and pleading prayers, meant to scare off anyone who wandered too close to places the elders wanted to keep secret. This manipulation had allowed them to craft the illusion of a cursed landscape, ensuring that no one would question the strange disappearances or explore the areas where bodies were rumored to be buried. It was psychological control disguised as folklore, a system that had been perfected across generations. The sisters at the center of the story had been among the first to realize something was deeply wrong, but every attempt they made to escape or expose the truth had been twisted against them. Instead of being remembered as victims of a corrupt and terror-driven system, they had been painted as unstable, dangerous, or possessed, their reputations ruined long before they had any chance to defend themselves. The town's leaders had relied on secrecy and manipulation for so long that they no longer seemed to understand the difference between maintaining order and committing cruelty. Their justifications, written in the margins of those hidden documents, revealed a chilling belief that their actions were necessary for the purity and preservation of the community. This belief had allowed them to commit unforgivable acts while convincing themselves they were protecting something sacred. When all these pieces finally came together, the true horror of the case became clear: not just the rituals, the voices, or the disappearances, but the realization that an entire community had been shaped by fear, guided by lies, and controlled by a few individuals who had built their power on suffering and silence.